First story. When my friend asked me to look after her child for the weekend, I gladly agreed. Little Emily was the sweetest girl, and I always got along with the children. So the meeting was scheduled for Friday evening, and I went to their house for a cozy weekend. The evening started normally. We played games, watched cartoons, and Emily even fell asleep earlier than usual. I lay down on the living room couch and turned on the TV for some privacy. Suddenly, I heard something strange. It was a faint, barely noticeable whisper, as if someone was muttering from behind. I looked around, but didn't see anyone. Thinking it was my imagination, I went back to watching TV. But the whisper returned, becoming louder. "Mom, Dad, help!" whispered an invisible presence. My skin broke out in goosebumps and I rushed to Emily's bedroom door to make sure she was okay. But the room was empty. She slept soundly, not noticing anything. I returned to the living room and tried to make out something unusual, but it was just quiet and empty. I began to doubt my sanity. Perhaps fatigue began to play a cruel joke on me. However, the whispering continued. Now it has become much clearer. "There is more than one. Help," it whispered again, and I realized that it was not my own thoughts. I tried to call my friend, but the mobile connection disappeared. As if in a daze, I remained sitting on the sofa, listening to the whispers, which became more and more intense. It sounded from everywhere, as if it penetrated the walls and filled the whole house. But no source was visible. Fear gripped me, and I rushed to Emily's bedroom to forget about the nightmare and disappear from this house. But upon entering the room, I discovered that the door was closed from the inside. I couldn't open it, and the whispering became even louder. Now it seemed like a plea. "Help! We are not alone. Help!" Emily slept, not noticing my struggle with the door. I realized that something unknown had trapped me inside and did not allow me to leave. What was it? Why was I chosen? Questions swirled in my head, and I felt that I had to unravel the mystery of this house if I wanted to get out of here alive. As time passed, the whispering began to grow noticeably. It seemed to penetrate inside my head, creating terrible pain. I felt that something, or maybe someone, was trying to contact me, but had no physical appearance. My panic only intensified. Forgetting about fear and deciding to clarify the situation, I decided to return to the living room and try to understand what was happening. The whispering was so intense that I almost couldn't concentrate. While I was standing in the center of the room, trying to collect my thoughts, the room suddenly began to change before my eyes. The furniture and walls began to disappear, and I found myself in some gloomy, empty corridor. Despair overwhelmed me, and I realized that I didn't know how to get back. The corridor was dark and ominous, as if leading to the unknown. I began to move forward, feeling that my fear was only increasing with each step. At the end of the corridor, I saw a door, and it was the only way out. When I opened the door, I was greeted by a sight that I will never forget. It was a room filled with dolls. Hundreds of them, of different sizes and types, stood on shelves, lay on tables, and even hung from the ceiling. But there was something more terrible. In each of them, I saw living, bright blue eyes that looked at me. I was so scared that my feet carried me back into the corridor, and I closed the door behind me. But my nightmares are not over. Each next step in the corridor led me to a new place of horror, where reality and dream merged together. Suddenly, I felt like someone or something was watching me. It followed me through this nightmarish labyrinth, and I was locked inside my own fears and nightmares. Second story. When my friend Lisa asked me to sit with her son Michael in the evening, I agreed without hesitation. After all, Michael was just a sweet 6-year-old boy, and I could not refuse my friend. We agreed that I would spend the night with them, since Lisa and her husband decided to celebrate their anniversary in the restaurant. When I arrived at their house, everything seemed normal. We played board games, watched cartoons, and even ate pizza. Michael was a sweet and cheerful child, and everything went smoothly. He fell asleep in his room, and I returned to the living room to spend the rest of the evening. Around midnight, I heard something strange. Footsteps and some whispering came from Michael's bedroom. I quickly walked to his door and quietly opened it. To my horror, the room was empty. I started searching, and my heart began to pound when I saw an open window. Michael disappeared, and panic took hold of me. I rushed into the yard, shouting his name, but received no answer. A call to the police, and Lisa was informed that her son had been kidnapped. They arrived within minutes and began investigating. But despite all efforts, no trace of Michael was found. Days passed, and the search continued, but hope was lost. I felt guilty that I couldn't protect Michael, and at night I heard his voice in my nightmares. He seemed so real to me that sometimes I woke up in tears. One night, while I was lying in bed, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and getting closer to my room. My heart sank, and I closed my eyes, afraid to look. The steps were getting closer, and suddenly I felt someone softly whispering my name. "Emma, help," the voice whispered. It was Michael's voice. I opened my eyes and looked down the corridor. Michael stood there, but his eyes were empty and his skin pale, as if he had been screwed into something for a long time. I screamed and rushed to him, but at that same second he disappeared like smoke. It was a nightmare, but why did it seem so real? We continued to look for Michael, but found nothing. Nobody could explain what happened, and now every night I hear Michael whispering to me for help. And every night he seems closer to me. Third story. Over the years, I worked as a nanny and raised many children, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. I was invited to work as a babysitter in a secluded country house that belonged to a strange family. I met the parents of the family, Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair, on the street when they approached me with an offer to hire a nanny for their child. They were strange, as if from another time, but I decided not to pay attention to it and agreed to the job. Upon arrival at the house, I was greeted by an unusual atmosphere. The house was gloomy, with antique furniture and portraits that seemed to have been preserved from the last century. Mrs. Sinclair led me into a room where a doll lay on a large bed. It was not just a doll, but an almost perfect copy of a little girl. She was even breathing and had a gentle pulse. "This is our daughter, Alma," said Mrs. Sinclair. "We lost her as a child, and since then she has been our only joy. You will look after her like a real child." I was a little embarrassed, but agreed. They paid well, and Alma, although she seemed like a strange toy to me, was cute. But over time, I began to notice something strange. In the evening, when my parents were leaving, they warned me that Alma should not be left alone. She demanded constant attention, like a real child. The first weeks were normal, but then strange things started happening. At night, I heard the rustling of the doll's legs on the floor, as if Alma was trying to go somewhere. I also noticed that things moved around in the room when neither of us touched them. Mrs. Sinclair claimed that these were Alma manifestations, and I decided to just ignore it. However, when I spent time with Alma, I felt that something was wrong. She was as if alive, looking at me with her glass eyes and as if trying to say something. I felt that this was more than just a doll. One night when my parents returned home, they found me in tears. I told them what was happening, and that Alma seemed alive to me. They were excited, but didn't talk about it. They simply carried Alma into her room and closed the door. Later, when I decided to leave and no longer work for this family, Mrs. Sinclair confessed something terrible to me. Alma was their real daughter, whom they lost many years ago. They could not accept her death and created a doll in her image to quench their pain. I realized that Alma was their last connection with their daughter, and she was alive for them. It was a story about how pain and anguish can lead to something irreversible and terrible. After talking with Mrs. Sinclair, I felt even more tense and puzzled. The family was completely isolated from the outside world, and their life was shrouded in a dark veil of mystery. I didn't know how to deal with this, but I left them and no longer accepted their orders as a nanny for Alma. However, this experience never left my thoughts. Everything I saw and heard in that house was too strange to forget. And I couldn't help but think about what happened to the Sinclair's real daughter, how they came to love and immortalize her image so much. Several years have passed since I left, and I decided to return to this city. I wanted to find out what happened to Alma and her parents. When I arrived at their house, it was abandoned, as if abandoned alone and abandoned by time. Local residents told me that the Sinclair family disappeared without a trace several years ago, and their house remained abandoned. Nobody knew where they went or what happened to them. The secret of their family remained forever unsolved. I felt that this house was forever permeated with mysticism and secrets of the past. And I had to ask myself, was it worth going back and digging into this dark history? But I couldn't stay ignorant any longer. Fourth story. When my friends asked me to babysit their son in the evening, I agreed, and little could I have imagined that this was the beginning of one of the strangest and most terrible evenings of my life. The house in which I was supposed to sit with little Daniel seemed ordinary and cozy. The parents left, leaving instructions and telephone numbers for urgent communication. Daniel, the sweet boy, quickly went to his room, leaving me in the living room with my toys. While I was sitting in the living room reading a book, I noticed that Daniel's toys were on the shelf in front of me. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming that he was just playing with them before. However, a few minutes later, when I looked in their direction, I saw that they were on the floor. The toys moved on their own. This moment left me in shock. I went to the toys and returned them to the shelf, but when I returned to the chair, they were back on the floor. I was scared, but decided that for some reason I might have just placed them incorrectly. I returned the toys to their place and stayed to watch. The toys began to move on their own, as if there was life underneath them. The little teddy bear rolled along the shelf, and the doll turned around as if it was talking to someone. My fear was growing every second. I decisively went to Daniel's room to ask him what was going on. He sat calmly on his bed and played with toys, suspecting nothing. I tried to explain to him what was happening, but he just smiled and said that his toys sometimes live their own lives. With these words, he returned to his game, and I was left confused. It was completely incomprehensible and strange. I decided to go back to the living room and watch the toys. The toys kept moving, and I couldn't explain how this was happening. Was it somehow related to Daniel or the house? I was completely confused and afraid to even move. This mysterious night began a chain of events that soon turned my life into a real nightmare. I could hardly imagine what horrors might await me ahead, and what terrible truth I would face. That evening, when the toys began to move on their own, I decided to stay in the house with Daniel to observe what was happening. My fear was intense, but I felt I had to find out what was going on. With every minute, what was happening became more and more strange. The toys moved places, sometimes even changed their poses, as if they were coming to life before my eyes. Daniel continued to play with them as if nothing was happening, and this scared me even more. Night came, and I decided to go to bed on the sofa in the living room, since I could not afford to tear myself away from what was happening. In the night, when everything was quiet, I heard quiet singing, and it came from Daniel's room. Approaching carefully, I saw that the toys were standing in a circle around his bed, and they seemed to be singing some strange melody. I stood there, not knowing what to do. It was too scary and incomprehensible. I decided to wake Daniel up to find out what was going on. But when I touched him, he was icy and motionless, as if he was sleeping in a deep sleep. The toys continued to sing their strange melody, and I felt fear overcome me. I decided to return to the couch and wait until morning to leave this house. But when morning came and the parents returned, they did not find Daniel in his room. Panic gripped everyone, and we started looking for him throughout the house. But there was not the slightest trace of him. The parents told me that they had lost another child many years ago, and this house seemed like a place where they could bring him back. I realized that the toys had disappeared with Daniel, and that they were the key to this mystical story. But where did they take the boy and why? It remained a mystery, and I felt guilty for not being able to protect him. This night remains in my memory as one of the most terrible and incomprehensible of my life. I never saw Daniel or his parents again, and this story remained unanswered, like a mystical nightmare. Fifth story. I had been a nanny for that family for several months, and at first glance, everything seemed ordinary. The family's home was cozy and beautifully furnished, and their son Tommy, a 6-year-old boy, was charming and always smiling. However, over time, I began to notice something strange that was hiding behind this ordinary facade. The evening when I discovered this secret began as usual. My parents went on a date, and I was left alone with Tommy. We played in his room and everything seemed fine, but when it came time for dinner, Tommy refused to eat. "Mom said I can't eat this," he said, pointing to a plate of macaroni and cheese. I was surprised, because it looked like an ordinary children's dish, but Tommy was persistent and refused to eat. I decided not to insist, but this made me suspicious. Later, when I was putting him to bed, Tommy started talking about some friend who lived in his room. He described him as a strange man in a black mask who comes to him at night. My hair stood on end on my head. I tried to console Tommy by telling him it was just a dream, but his description was too detailed. Over the next few weeks, Tommy continued to talk about his mysterious friend. He claimed that this friend was forcing him to do strange things, such as not eating certain foods and going to certain parts of the house. I decided to ask him in more detail, and what I learned stunned me. Tommy said that his friend was telling him something scary and that he shouldn't tell anyone, not even his parents. He described how a friend promised to punish him if he broke this rule. My fear and anxiety only increased. I decided that I could not remain silent about what I heard. After my parents returned, I told them everything that happened. Their expressions became gloomy and they explained that they could not tell me the whole truth. In order to find out what was going on, I began to conduct my own investigations. I found out that something terrible happened to Tommy's family, and they are trying to hide it. I decided to solve this puzzle and find out the truth, despite the dangers that could await me. With every day I spent with Tommy's family, my resolve to solve the mystery grew stronger. I began to watch my parents' every step, carefully studying their reactions and communication. They continued to keep me in the dark, but I was determined not to give up. One day, while my parents were at work, I decided to conduct a little investigation in the house. I searched their room, trying to find any evidence or recordings that might reveal Tommy's secret. But my searches were unsuccessful. Then my gaze fell on the door to the basement. The door was locked, and it seemed interesting to me. I decisively headed towards the house in search of the keys. Soon I found them in a drawer with kitchen utensils, and I decided that the moment had come. I took the keys and returned to the door to the basement. With uneasy feelings, I unlocked the lock and slowly opened the door. The gloomy and cold air hid my face. The lighting in the basement was dim, and I began to walk down the steep stairs. The deeper I went, the more pressure I felt around me. Suddenly, my steps led me to a closed door. I opened it and found myself in a room lit by flickering candlelight. The entire wall was decorated with strange symbols and drawings, and in the middle of the room stood a wooden statue of a man wearing a black mask. My heart began to beat faster and fear overtook me. I looked around the room and my gaze fell on a table with many notes and drawings. They seemed crazy and confusing, but something about them made me think. These notes were related to ancient rituals and magic, and I realized that Tommy's parents had learned to practice them. However, the worst thing was that on the wall I saw dozens of photographs of children, among whom was Tommy. They were smeared with red paint, as if they had been erased from life. At that moment it became clear to me that Tommy's family was involved in mystical rituals and sacrifices. With fear and horror, I realized that I had found the answer to my question. But what should I do with this information? Tommy's family secret turned out to be much darker and scarier than I could ever have imagined. My investigations had led me to the truth, but now I had to decide what to do with this knowledge and how to protect Tommy from the danger that threatened him from within his own family. 6th story. Like a ghostly sentence, this old lady's invitation sounded like a mysterious melody. When I first saw her through the door on the street, she seemed so lonely and fragile that I could not refuse her request to take care of her children. I was overcome with fear, but out of my kindness, I decided to agree. We entered her house and were instantly greeted by darkness and cold. The old lady led me along a long, narrow corridor, the walls of which were dotted with old paintings of children. Their faces looked dark and menacing, as if they were expecting something terrible. My fear grew with every step, but I held it back. I didn't want to show my anxious feelings in front of the old woman. We walked through all the rooms, and each of them was gloomy and filled with old things that seemed lost to time. The whole thing was like a horror museum. Finally, we found ourselves in the backyard, where there was a huge oak tree. Scattered underneath were old toys that looked like they had been abandoned for a long time. The old woman pointed to the toys and said that these were her children. I couldn't believe my ears. She spoke of them as if they were living beings. My hand shook when she tried to take one of the toys, but the old lady held me back. She then pointed to 2 graves where women's and men's names were written. Apparently, these were her 2 children who died long ago. She started talking about them as if they were still alive, and my eyes widened in fear. I realized that the old lady was completely crazy. Suddenly, all my fear and determination disappeared, and I realized that my life was in danger. Nothing could stop me from running away from this nightmare place. I turned around sharply and ran to the door, hoping that the old woman would not be able to catch up with me. My soul was filled with horror, and I knew that this house would never see me again. I ran as if evil itself was pursuing me, and when I finally ran out of that gloomy house, I felt the breath of freedom suddenly return to me. Tears flowed down my cheeks, and I could not believe that I was drawn into such a terrible story. With heavy breathing and broken nerves, I returned home, closed the door, and no longer wanted to think about this terrible adventure, but I had a feeling that the old woman's dark secret had not yet been revealed. What were those children whose graves lay in the backyard, and why did she think I should be closer to them? Days passed, and I tried to forget about everything, but the nightmares and memories of that house did not leave me. One evening, as I was watching the news, a terrible feeling came over me. The news reported about an old woman who was found dead in her home. Apparently, her lonely fate ended tragically. However, what really shocked me was the following message. Another grave was discovered in the old woman's house, the one that she called my workplace. All things began to fit together into a mosaic of a terrible story, and I realized that the old woman was not crazy. She was something much worse. Since then, I could no longer sleep peacefully. All this time, I felt that the dark secrets of this house had not yet been fully revealed. What was waiting for me under the oak tree and in that last grave? But I decided that I would never return to this nightmare world again and would leave the old woman's secrets in the past where they belong. 7th story. This story began with an ordinary babysitter's night. I was hired to look after 2 children in an old house in the middle of a dark forest. My parents left for a party, leaving me alone with the children. The house was old, full of creaking doors and a bored wind that howled outside the window. The children were attentive and obedient, and I even calmed down, thinking that the evening would go smoothly. However, after the parents left, something in the house began to seem strange. The pictures on the walls seemed to change before my eyes, and the air in the room became colder. After getting the kids into their bedroom and putting them to bed, I decided to relax and look for a book here. I've always been fascinated by old things and antiques, so I started rummaging through old boxes in the living room. As soon as I came across the door leading to the basement, the hair on my arms stood on end. Deciding that this might be interesting, I decided to explore the basement. As I walked down the old wooden steps, the darkness became more and more dense. I turned on my flashlight and slowly looked around the room. Suddenly, my light fell on something terrible. Before me, as if in a place forgotten for centuries, stood skeletons. They were dressed in ancient clothes and lay in coffins, as if they were waiting for their time to return to life. The looks of their empty eyes seemed filled with anger and melancholy. I screamed in horror and ran upstairs. The children woke up and asked in fear what had happened. I told them that I was just scared upstairs, and we sat in their room until my parents returned. When my parents arrived, I told them what I saw in the basement. They turned pale and said that they had never seen these skeletons and did not know that they were in their house. We called the police, and it soon became clear that these skeletons were the remains of the long-lost occupants of this old house. The mystery of this place turned out to be much more creepy than I could have imagined, and since then I have never returned to that old house, which turned out to be full of terrible secrets and sinister secrets. After that terrible evening in the old house, my nightmares and disturbing dreams began to haunt me. Skeletons, evil and dead eyes, a basement full of fear, all this forever remained in my memory. I could no longer work as a nanny, and even just entering old houses became an extremely difficult task for me. The investigation continued, and the police were investigating the origin of those skeletons. It turned out that they belonged to people who disappeared from this house many years ago. It became a local legend, a story whispered about in quiet towns and old circles. Over time, my fear began to subside, and I tried to return to normal life. But even after all these years, I still periodically dreamed about those skeletons and the basement of the old house. There was a cautious fear inside me that the house's past and its terrible secrets might come back to remind me of its existence. I no longer worked as a nanny and avoided old, gloomy houses. Instead, I devoted myself to researching the history and legends of mysterious houses and mysterious events. My goal was to understand what happened in that old house and what forces were hidden within its walls. And although I understood that it was unlikely that I would ever be able to unravel all the mysteries of that terrible evening, I hoped that my research would help me understand this dark story. I knew that my fears might have been unfounded, but one thing remained forever: my fear of old houses and their dark secrets that could destroy the lives of those who dared to enter them. Eighth story. It was already late in the evening when I was hired as a nanny for a strange family. Their house was located far from the city, in the middle of dark forests. Even when I approached the house, it looked frightening, as if calling me into its mysterious embrace. The children's parents quickly said goodbye and left, leaving me alone with their small children. The children's glances were secret, as if they knew something that I did not know. The house was large and intricate, with many rooms and corridors. The evening passed calmly, but not without strange things. Things moved on their own, and the air became colder. I looked at the strange paintings on the walls, which depicted scenes of medieval torture and sacrifice. I felt like I was in a horror museum, but I tried not to be scared. It was only the beginning that was interesting. When it was time to put the children to bed, I was called to a corridor that I had not noticed before. I followed him and found a room in which absolute chaos reigned. The furniture was overturned, the walls were covered in a strange viscous substance, and there was a pile of red mush on the floor. A strange and disgusting smell came from this porridge. Tried to figure out what was happening, but suddenly I heard a quiet whisper and the sounds of movement. I turned to run away, but the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening noise. And then I saw them, the skeletons of children standing in the room, like ghosts of the past. Each time their bones reflected the light of the candle, as if they had become alive. My heart sank, and I realized that this place was full of secrets and horrors that surrounded me. What happened next remained my secret nightmare. I tried to get to the door, but the skeletons moved faster than my legs. A piercing scream rang out in the room, and all my senses were drowned in darkness. The skeletons slowly approached me, and each step they took felt like a blow to my heart. I tried to convey to them my fear and bewilderment, but their empty eye sockets pierced me like icy arrows. My plea to leave me alone sounded empty. However, when they were already at arm's length, something happened. They suddenly stopped and began to make dark and scary sounds, as if they were experiencing fear or pain. I realized that something was bothering them. Looking back, I saw the candlelight, which suddenly began to flicker and go out. The room was shrouded in darkness, and the skeletons disappeared, as if they had disappeared into the darkness. I decided not to linger and rushed to the door, which, to my surprise, I managed to open. From that night on, I never returned to that house or babysat again. It was a nightmare that left a deep mark on me. I never found out what was really in that room and why the skeletons of children came to life. But one thing was clear. The place was filled with terrible secrets and sinister forces that require no explanation. Ninth story. It was late in the evening when I was asked to take care of a little boy named Tommy. I had been working as a nanny for several years, and it was a routine task for me. But what happened that night, I will never be able to forget. Tommy's mother explained to me that her son often has strange dreams and becomes scared. He acted strangely, as if something was scaring him. I reassured the mother, saying that I was an experienced nanny and knew how to calm children. When she left, I went to Tommy. The boy sat on his bed and shook as if from fear. I asked him what happened, but he didn't want to talk. There was inexpressible anxiety in his eyes. I had to persuade him to tell me what scared him so much. Tommy started talking about his dream as if it was the scariest thing in the world. In his dream, he saw something unidentifiable that was approaching him. Something he couldn't describe in words. He was so scared that his hands were shaking. I tried to console him and told him that it was just a dream, that nothing bad would happen. He nodded and went to bed. I stayed with him in his room to make sure he slept without nightmares. But when he fell asleep, strange sounds suddenly started coming from his bedroom. I heard some shuffling and groaning, and my fear took over me again. I slowly approached Tommy's bed and looked at him. What I saw made my heart skip a beat. Tommy was lying on the bed, but his eyes were open, and they were full of fear and despair. He slowly raised his hand and pointed to the corner of the room. When I turned around, suddenly a shadow emerged from the darkness, something completely inhuman. It was a gloomy creature with huge eyes and pale skin. It stood there as if waiting for something. As I carried Tommy out of his room, something inside me made me turn around and look at the clothes closet in the corner of the room. It was there, in the darkness, that I saw something strange. A gloomy, terrible eye, sparkling in the darkness. It was pointed directly at me, and I felt like the whole world stopped for a moment. Fear and horror gripped me, but I knew I had to react. I quickly closed the door of the room and did not tell Tommy what I saw. Instead, I carried him to the car, trying to preserve his innocence and hide him from the terrible creature that was hiding inside his own home. After getting Tommy to safety, I called the police and told them what happened. Officers arrived immediately and searched the home. And, as it turned out, Inside the closet they found a 30-year-old psychopath who had been hiding there for several days. The psychopath was wearing dirty clothes and looked crazy. He didn't say a word, and his eyes were full of madness. He was arrested and taken to the local police station. The police found out that he had somehow entered the house and was hiding there, watching the family. He planned to kidnap Tommy and possibly commit an even worse crime. Thanks to my reaction and calling the police, this terrible plan was averted. Tommy's mother was grateful for my actions and I felt like a hero. But I had mixed feelings, horror from what I saw in that room, and pride that I was able to save the boy. That night left a deep imprint on my soul, and I could never work as a nanny again.